Can you hear me okay back there?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. How many of you have been here before when Professor Symonds has given presentations? Okay, so you're very familiar with him. You know it's going to be an exciting afternoon. I know we have at least one World War II veteran here from the Pacific. I'd like to have all the World War II veterans stand up. Carl, thank you very much for being here. I've had the opportunity to introduce Professor Symonds several times. I'm not going to go, most of you know him, I'm not going to go into any great detail. A national, internationally known historian, professor at the Naval Academy for close to 30 years, if not over 30 years, is now Professor Emeritus in history from the Naval Academy. While we were stationed at the Naval Academy together, a movie was in production, Patriot Games. And Harrison Ford was actually there to do the shooting. This is probably something you don't know. Harrison Ford shadowed Craig Symonds around the Naval Academy to learn how to become a history professor while he was there. I don't know if he shadowed him with doing the other things or whether Jack Ryan is based on Craig Symonds. All I can tell you is that Harrison Ford did not shadow me around. He shadowed Craig around. I think the book, unfortunately, I've not had a chance to read the book yet, but I really look forward to it. Two comments. One, I think everyone, I was talking with Jim Hornfisher, and I think everyone is very familiar with Overlord and Omaha Beach and The Longest Day, etc., etc. But what is not well known is the Navy's part, Neptune, in the landing on Normandy. And knowing Craig and how he not only is an unbelievable historian, but also a great writer, I really look forward to reading about that. But without further ado, let me introduce and bring on Professor Symonds.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that a lot. Just to follow up briefly on the Harrison Ford story, it was only a year or two after that I went to the British Naval Academy at Dartmouth to teach for a year as a visitor. And I was interviewed by the local press there, and they had heard the story. So the reporter leans in close to me across the desk and asks me now, just between us, "Are you really CIA? Are you over here to find out what's going on?" And I said, "Well, of course not. Of course I'm not CIA," which is exactly what I would say if I were. So the article that subsequently appeared was very skeptical about my actual role. I'm delighted to be here again at the National Museum of the Pacific War. I want to say just a brief commercial before I start talking about D-Day, and that is that virtually everyone in this room, I'm sure, knows about the contribution made by this institution, the museum, and its events such as the one you're attending today. Probably less of you know about the Nimitz Educational and Research Center, the NERC. Everything has to have an acronym these days. I spent yesterday afternoon and this morning in the archives here, researching mostly the oral histories that the people associated here, some of you I'm sure as well, have gathered from World War II veterans. And what a priceless archive that is. And I'm delighted now that it has an equally priceless home. Actually, it does have a price on it. Many of you contributed to that price, and we're very grateful. When I began researching the Midway book some years ago, many of those sources were piled into a little shed, like a little garage, parked out here behind the Peace Garden, and they were piled up, leaning precariously. It looked like my garage at home. And I worried about their future, but now world-class archive, and you should all be very proud that it's here in Fredericksburg. I'm going to talk about D-Day today. You said, well, wait a minute, that wasn't in the Pacific, was it? And it wasn't, of course. But I think one of the reasons Mike asked me to come is that he knew I had done a lot of work here in the archive in a collection that was donated here just a couple of years ago by the LCI, Landing Craft Infantry Association, veterans who participated, served in World War II on LCIs in both theaters, Atlantic and Pacific, but they chose this facility as the home for their archive. And it was a terrific experience to work through those documents and gather that material. And in the back of the book, you'll see a reference in the bibliography to the collection here in Fredericksburg. Most of you, I suspect, have seen Saving Private Ryan. Am I correct? Can I see how many? Maybe I should ask how many have not. I mean, I'm sure almost everyone has. That opening 20-minute scene is one of the best depictions that I've seen, and of course I was not at Omaha Beach, but one of the most believable, realistic depictions of combat on film. Like most great historic events, though, it's one with a long and meaningful backstory. One that traces its origins back at least to December 7, 1941, which is when I began the book, but in fact you could trace it back further to May of 1940, when the British Expeditionary Force and remnants of the Belgian and French armies were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. Because it was then that the British, at the time, and eventually the Americans as well, began to think about how and where, and especially when, it might become possible to insert large forces back onto the continent in force. But before that could happen, if indeed it could happen at all, the Allies first had to recruit the armies, train the men, build the planes and the tanks, the artillery pieces they would need to engage their foes, and above all, they would need to find and build the ships that would carry the men and their equipment, first across a broad ocean, and then more ships that would be needed to guard those transports from the predations of Nazi U-boats, and then more ships that could keep the men supplied, not only with bombs and bullets, but given that it was an American army, with Coca-Cola and Hershey bars, and mail, plus more ships, indeed very specially designed ships that could carry them across the English Channel, land them on a defended beach, and support them there. And quite apart from all of that, the Allies would need even more ships, thousands more ships, to fight a simultaneous war in the Pacific. That voracious demand for shipping was the single most important factor in planning the Allied invasion of Europe, because without those ships, all the planning was simply fatuous. In short, the story of D-Day does not begin with that brief, horrific moment we see in that first 20-minute clip from Saving Private Ryan, when those young men, many of them teenagers, charged out onto that deadly beach. It was also the years of planning, building, and training, as well as the landing, and that's the story I'd like to share with you this afternoon. It's a story that, like a lot of military history, falls rather naturally into three parts. There's a strategic element, that is the decision to do it at all, including where, and as I mentioned, especially when. That's followed by the logistical component. There's an old line that every military person or military historian has heard and used, which is that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. You can make all the plans in the world that you want, but you must have the wherewithal to execute those plans, and that is mostly a logistical problem. And that, of course, means the assembly of the men, the construction of the material, and the building of those ships. And finally, there's the operational story. This is the one most of us find most exciting. It includes the training on the English beaches, the landing itself, including that iconic moment on Omaha Beach, so vividly portrayed in Spielberg's film. And all of that preliminary work, the planning, the logistical work, the training, the movement across the channel, all of that was known as Operation Neptune. Overlord was the larger code name, almost said nickname, that hardly applies here, code name for the invasion of Europe, but Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, was the name for the planning and the naval element. So I'm going to start with with the strategic planning, figure out just how the Anglo-American allies made the decision to do this. You know, we've had a lot of talk in the 70 years since then about the special relationship between the British and the Americans. And yet, despite the ties of a common heritage, a more or less common language, and certainly a common foe, the Allied partnership, from the moment of its inception, and even before the moment of its inception, was marked by uncertainty, disagreement, tense, sometimes even bitter negotiations. We'll start with a photograph. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if I can get this picture to show up, I will. There it is. This one, I suspect, may be worth at least 2,000. I'm going to spend at least 2,000 talking about it, so that makes it true. You know those two guys in front. There's FDR on the left, flashing his famous campaign smile. From the very beginning of the war in Europe, in September of 1939, Roosevelt had supplied Britain and supported Britain in its unequal contest with Nazi Germany, and he did so not just with his words, but with supplies and equipment insofar as the public would let him, stretching both the law and, according to his opponents, even the Constitution, almost to the breaking point, to ensure that the British could hold out against the Nazis. And he did that at great political risk. American isolationists, including popular spokesmen like Charles Lindbergh, most clerics, most Republicans, even FDR's own ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future president, all opposed him on this and did so vociferously. And one reason that they did so was that many of them suspected that such support violated the spirit, if not in fact the letter, of American neutrality. There were laws against this. In addition, most of them believed that Britain was almost certain to lose this war to Hitler, in which case all of the supplies and all of the equipment that America sent there would end up in the hands of the Germans anyway. But FDR bet that the British would win, or at least that they would hold out. He was determined to do all that he could to make sure that was true. FDR was a very deft politician. He had his finger on the pulse of American public opinion almost every day he was in the White House. And he pushed as far as he sensed that American public opinion would let him go in support of Britain. And when the moment shifted, he pounced to do everything that he possibly could. He managed to convince a majority of Americans, mostly through those famous fireside chats, that Britain's survival was essential to American security. They're fighting for us. And he got his way on most issues, including, crucially, Lend-Lease, the program that did allow Britain to survive, though barely, through those dark days of 1940 and 1941. Now, to FDR's right, as you look at this photo, actually, he's on our right, FDR's left, is Winston Spencer Churchill, gravel-voiced survivor of 1,000 parliamentary debates, and the determined foe of what he always called Nazism, as if the root word for that was not Nazi, but nausea. Churchill was grateful for the support that Roosevelt was able to provide, but what he really wanted was American belligerency. Consequently, throughout the period of American neutrality, and even once the war began, once the United States was a full partner in the war, Churchill in this relationship was the supplement, coming hand in hand, a position that was uncomfortable for him, to the rich Americans who asked, begged for whatever we could supply. Roosevelt was the one being wooed. This photo, by the way, was taken in August of 1941. That's still 4 months before Pearl Harbor. And the two men are on board a British battleship, HMS Prince of Wales, anchored in a bay, Argentia Bay, off Newfoundland. Just as an aside, by the way, no one in this photograph, of course, or anywhere else knew it at the time, but only months later, 4 months later, in fact, the Prince of Wales would be sunk by a Japanese aircraft staged out of French Indochina and go to the bottom. To arrange this meeting, FDR risked a lot, and not only politically, because here he is as the head of a neutral country meeting openly with a belligerent power. That in itself could be a violation of America's neutrality laws. But to do it, supposedly to throw the Germans off their stroke, but also to throw the press in America off its stroke, he sneaked away from Washington, pretending he was going on a fishing trip, and then in a fog bank, getting into a small motorcraft and going over to an American cruiser, and then heading north to Newfoundland without anybody knowing about it, including the Secret Service. Can you imagine such a thing today? Pulling a fast one on the Secret Service? At the time this photo was taken, in August of 1941, Roosevelt was still hoping the United States would be able to limit its role in the war to being what he called the arsenal of democracy, the great arsenal of democracy. In effect, he hoped that the United States could continue to provide the tanks, the planes, the equipment, the rifles, ammunition, all the other material of war, while Britain and her Commonwealth partners, of course, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, could not only hold out, but eventually win the war. That hope had become much more realistic just 2 months before this photograph was taken, with what in hindsight is evidently the single most important turning point in the war, Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, while Britain still remained defiant in its island. With American money, Russian blood, and British grit, Roosevelt thought that Hitler might be beaten without the United States having to go to war. Of course, the strategic landscape changed dramatically after Pearl Harbor. Churchill was thrilled at last to have the United States as a full ally. But he feared that given the character of the Japanese attack on December 7th, on a Sunday morning without announcement, the sneak attack, American public opinion would be so outraged it would compel Roosevelt, always sensitive to the public mood, to concentrate on the Japanese in the Pacific rather than on Hitler in Europe. He need not have worried about that. For as it happened in the months just before Pearl Harbor, the United States had already settled on a new strategic plan based on the assumption that Hitler's Germany was by far the more serious threat to the United States, and that it would have to be defeated before the United States turned to the threat from Japan. And interestingly, it was an American admiral, Harold Stark, whom we see here, with the stripes climbing up his sleeve, who was mainly responsible for the construction of that new plan. The memo that he drafted for the Joint Chiefs, not yet called the Joint Chiefs, but acting essentially as the Joint Chiefs, called Plan DOG, because DOG, Delta, we would say today, was the fourth alternative in a series of options that he presented, and that was the one he said best suited to America's strategic concerns. Defeat Germany first. On the other hand, Churchill also learned that the Americans took the view that since Germany was going to be the first and most important target, now that the war had begun, the only thing to do was to get on with it immediately. This is an American characteristic. We all recognize it. We know what we're like. We're impatient. We want it, and we want it now. When we decide what we want, we often conclude that explanations like logistics and you can't really do that right now just are not part of the argument. The British were rather taken aback by this. Their view was, well, yes, that's all very well and good. The Germans are indeed bad, and we do want to beat them, but we must be practical about these things. Their preference was to postpone an invasion of continental Europe until the Nazi Empire was almost on the brink of collapse, attack them from the periphery, bomb them from the air, encourage the uprising of subject nations already conquered by the Nazis. And at some point, the German Empire would begin to totter, and that would be the time to kick in the door and land on the French beaches. This difference in views between the British and American planners became a running dispute that lasted for most of 2 years. The principal advocate of an early Allied landing in Europe was the Army Chief of Staff. He's here too. There he is, between these two gentlemen, looking over their shoulders, metaphorically and literally. That is the Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. In public memory in the United States, Marshall is one of the great unsung heroes of the Second World War because he did not get to command on the battlefield because he was passed over for command of Overlord. Fewer Americans have heard of him perhaps than General Eisenhower, who commanded the invasion and then became president. But Marshall, probably as much as any other individual, deserves credit for being the principal architect of Allied victory. He is engaged in conversation. I was about to say he's talking to, but if you look at this photo, he's actually listening to his Navy counterpart, Ernest J. King. That's kind of a metaphor as well. Ernest King listened to few and talked often, and usually quite loudly, and often punctuated by rather colorful language. King, the American Chief of Naval Operations, and about to be named also COMING, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, that is the operational as well as the administrative commander of the United States Navy in World War II. King was, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but let's just say he was skeptical of all this Europe First business. Not officially, of course. He was a professional, lifelong professional, and would not openly contradict the president or national policy. But he was also determined to make sure that the Japanese did not get a chance to consolidate their conquests in the Western Pacific before we had to take them all back again at the cost of American blood and American money. So while we're busy defeating Germany, he wanted to make sure the Japanese did not have a chance to fortify what they captured in the first 6 months of the war. So Marshall's job here is twofold. He has to convince the British that his plan is a good one, and the United States Navy that his plan is a good one, and Churchill and Roosevelt. Note the fellow just to Marshall's left, that is over Churchill's left shoulder. Here he is, right here, this fellow. He's looking at Marshall and King rather skeptically. What are you Americans talking about over there? I wish I could eavesdrop on you. And well, he might. This is the British General Sir John Dill. He had been the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, about to be replaced by Alan Brooke, but Churchill had brought him with him on this trip over to talk to the Americans, and had done so deliberately. His notion was, if this thing works out, I'll just leave Dill behind, and he can be kind of my presence here in America. And that is, in fact, what happened. And I think that, like George Marshall, Sir John Dill is one of the underappreciated players in the strategic planning of the Second World War. He ended up being a liaison between the two English-speaking powers talking back to his own superiors in London, including Churchill when it was necessary, and few people could do that and live to tell the tale. And also gracefully presenting British views to the Americans. Alas, or Dill, he did not live to see the fruit of his efforts. He died in 1944 and is one of only 6 non-Americans to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, not pictured in this photograph, and it's a significant omission, of course, are any of the Russians, because it's the Russians who at this time were bearing the full brunt of the war against Germany. And they were positively frantic for the Anglo-Americans to open a second front in France to take the pressure off them. Stalin suspected, and not without some cause, that Churchill's opposition, his foot dragging, if you would, toward opening an early second front in Europe, was motivated, at least in part, because he was willing, Churchill that is, Churchill was willing to fight the Germans to the very last Russian. Churchill might have put it slightly differently. He was willing to fight the Nazis to the last communist. Nazis are killing communists and communists are killing Nazis. Why are we in a hurry to stop it? Before I leave this slide and move on to the rest of the story, there are 2 more characters I want to point out. They are there on the left of the slide, talking to one another. That fellow with his hands behind his back is Harry Hopkins. Hopkins would prove as important in holding together the Anglo-American alliance as Sir John Dill, maybe more so, in fact. Hopkins was Roosevelt's most trusted advisor, second to maybe not even second to Eleanor herself. Hopkins, alas, was a sickly wraith of a man. He was a cancer survivor, and most of his stomach and half of his intestines had been cut out of him, so he could not process food properly. He weighed about 105 pounds and was easily exhausted. None of that stopped him from working 20-hour days, however, and Roosevelt exploited him terribly, sending him on these transatlantic flights to talk to one ally or another, and Hopkins would often get off the plane so ill he had to be immediately hospitalized and transfused before he could even get onto his feet and go on to do his work. The workload probably killed him, though unlike Dill, he at least lived to see the end of the war, dying in January of 1946 at the age of 55. That handsome fellow who was whispering in Hopkins' ear is Averell Harriman, who FDR had sent to London to coordinate Lend-Lease aid. Churchill may or may not have been aware of it. I suspect he was, but kept his mouth shut, that the 50-year-old and married Harriman was having a torrid love affair with Churchill's 21-year-old daughter-in-law, Pamela, married to Churchill's only son, Randolph, then serving in the British Army in Egypt. Decades later, after everyone in this slide, except Harriman, of course, was dead, the 80-year-old Harriman and 50-year-old Pamela would marry. And decades after that, Pamela Harriman would become John Kennedy's choice as the United States ambassador to France. It's a remarkable photograph to have contain all of these principal players in this strategic tale. The questions they had to resolve: shall we invade? Well, absolutely. Where shall we invade? Well, there was some back and forth about the Pas-de-Calais versus the coast of Normandy, but that really was a secondary issue. The big issue was when. When to invade. And that was very problematic. It was Marshall who presented the first serious full proposal for an invasion. He called for an Anglo-American landing in France in May of 1943. May 1st, 1943 was going to be D-Day. The British, of course, expressed, oh, great idea, we're all for it. I mean, at this point, they're so delighted to have the Americans as an ally, they would have agreed to almost anything, but their enthusiasm was somewhat muted. After all, the proposed landing date was 16 months away. A lot could happen in 16 months. There would be plenty of time later to bring up questions if there were any, and who knew, maybe Germany would begin to totter by May of 1943. The more immediate question was this: what are we going to do in the meantime? Surely the Americans did not intend for their entire forces and all of the British forces and all the Commonwealth forces to sit around for 16 months building up their capability in Britain, waiting until May of 1943 to attack the Germans. Among other things, the Russians were unlikely to stand for that. And another was the American public was not likely to stand for that. If we're just going to sit around for 16 months, Ernest J. King would say to them, you know, I've got places where we could use those forces in the Pacific. No, there must be some other way to use these troops. It had to be sooner, it had to be this year, it had to be in 1942, and it had to be somewhere in Europe. But that was not possible. Well, unsurprisingly, Churchill had a plan ready to mind. He argued the Allies should seize French North Africa. Marshall thought this was a terrible idea. There were no Germans in French North Africa. Not one. It belonged to Vichy France. Now, France had been defeated, and Vichy France was a bit of a puppet and a bit of a fake regime anyway, but technically, legally, it was a neutral power with whom the United States had diplomatic relations. How different was it for the United States to attack neutral Vichy France unannounced than it had been for the Japanese to strike at Pearl Harbor? And what good is that going to do us against the Germans anyway? I said not a single German in sight. Moreover, Marshall's real fear was that once you step through that door, once you put American and British forces on the ground in North Africa, the entire Mediterranean basin would act as a kind of a black hole, a gravitational force that would draw reinforcements, supplies, equipment, materiel into that front until an invasion of Europe in May of 1943 became impossible. And he was right. The landings in North Africa led inexorably perhaps to a campaign in Tunisia. That led to an invasion of Sicily. That led to an invasion of Italy. And long before that took place, it had become obvious, exactly as Marshall feared, that the momentum of events had drawn the war fully into the Mediterranean, which is very likely exactly what Churchill had in mind all along. So Marshall had been right. But Churchill was also right, because the extended campaign in North Africa demonstrated more clearly than any British argument could have done that the Anglo-American allies were simply not ready for the kind of effort that would have been necessary to invade northern France in the spring or summer of 1943. The landings in Morocco, the American landings in Morocco at Safi and elsewhere, had been marked with blunders and reversals, a kind of Keystone Cops comedy of mistakes. The campaign ashore had been equally dispiriting. The worst disaster, of course, and representative perhaps of the campaign was the humiliating American defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, where two German panzer divisions cut up the American army horribly. All of that demonstrated just how unready the Americans were to take on the Wehrmacht. And besides all that, there was still the logistical question. The shipping to make it happen did not exist in 1943. And in addressing that, we move from a strategic issue to the logistical one. I love this slide. It suggests something about the scope of the effort made by the United States, being the arsenal of democracy, to provide the material, in this case the ships, that made the operation possible. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States had embarked on a truly historic shipbuilding program. In 1941 alone, this is before Pearl Harbor now, the United States produced just over 1 million tons of shipping. That's a very big number. But in February of 1942, Roosevelt went to the United States Maritime Commission and said they had to build 8 million tons in 1942. Well, such numbers were just staggering. We'd say to the British, we're going to build 8 million tons of shipping this year, and the British would slap their heads and, that's not possible. And then Roosevelt wanted 10 million. 16 million tons all told. And the head of the Maritime Commission, Admiral Land, told him, Mr. President, I don't think that's possible. But he got it done. And when he did, Roosevelt apparently said to himself, well, gee, if you reach the bar that I set, apparently I didn't set it high enough. So I went back and asked for 24 million tons of shipping. Unimaginable amounts. And to meet those goals, workers at shipyards like this one, this is the Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had 18 shipyards like this one, and there were other companies as well. This is the one at Portland, Oregon, by the way. And it worked around the clock, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. The photo here shows workers on the swing shift, that is 4 p.m. to midnight, lining up to replace the day shift workers. They in turn would be replaced by those on the night shift who labored from midnight to 8 a.m. under giant arc lights that lit up the shipyards all the way around the periphery of the country. And so it went 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The welding machines were never turned off. They were simply passed hand to hand. The workers, by the way, earned 50 cents an hour, which after deducting $1.40 for old age benefits under this new program called Social Security, left them with $18.60 for a 40-hour week, though most of them worked overtime.